Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG on YouTube and Twitch. Helena, how's it going?
Yeah, not doing too badly. I'm happy to be joining from my own bedroom today rather than from the Novara studio, but as always, good to be back.
I know, but we miss you in the studio. Coming up tonight, the US's trade war with China. Ben and Jerry's are suing their parent company for silencing them on Palestine, and a deep dive on how the media have failed Gaza. The Republican Party has now secured majorities in both the Houses of Representatives and the Senate. That means Republicans will control all the key legislative levers of power, potentially giving President-elect Donald Trump carte blanche to enact a sweeping agenda. And Trump has shown no sign of slowing down his flurry of controversial cabinet picks.
President-elect Donald Trump has nominated his pick for Attorney General, and that is Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz, a Republican firebrand, a lightning rod for controversy. These confirmation hearings are going to be intense, to say the least.
The Attorney General is the US's chief law enforcement officer, heading up the Department of Justice and directing the government's legal positions on critical issues such as abortion, civil rights, and First Amendment cases. Matt Gaetz is a name that Washington insiders really never expected to hear for the role, perhaps because until last year, Gaetz was under investigation by the Department of Justice over allegations of sex trafficking and sex with a minor. The Department of Justice declined to bring charges and closed the case in February 2023. And Gaetz has always strenuously denied the allegations.
The whole concept of sex charges against me was really just a way to try to bleed my family out of money and probably smear my name because I am a well-known, outspoken conservative, and I guess that's out of style in a lot of parts of the country right now.
Now, if confirmed, Gaetz would be in charge of running the very department that had investigated him over allegations of statutory rape and sex trafficking. Now, it's statutory rape because 18 is the age of consent in Florida where the act is alleged to have taken place. The former Florida congressman is a die-hard Trump loyalist who falsely claimed that Antifa was responsible for the Capitol insurrection in January 2021. Gaetz made headlines in 2023 for leading the charge to get rid of former Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. And today, US representatives and lawmakers from across the political divide have voiced their shock at his nomination.
Mr. Gaetz breaks things to break things, and then once he breaks it even more. And that is somebody who should not be the Attorney General of the United States.
It must be the worst nomination for a cabinet position in American history. I think this is something that falls well outside the scope of deference that should be given to a president in nominating members of his senior team. Gaetz is not only totally incompetent for this job, he doesn't have the character. He is a person of moral turpitude. And notwithstanding how difficult it may be politically, this is a nomination the Republican Party should oppose.
I mean, clearly, it's just kind of like a God tier kind of trolling, just to trigger a meltdown.
That was the Republican Ohio Representative Max Miller, former U.S. National Security Advisor and Republican John Bolton, and Democrat Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman. Matt Gaetz will need Senate approval before he can be confirmed as Attorney General. The Republican Senator for Maine, Susan Collins, made this comment to reporters. That shows why the advice and consent process of Senate confirmation is so important, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions raised at his hearing. Republicans have a 53-seat majority in the Senate, so Matt Gaetz's appointment may go through without a hitch. But another controversial Trump nomination announced last night was Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence.
Tulsi Gabbard is a pick that will certainly be celebrated by the Russian state media. For years now, she's been accused of parroting lines that could be taken off of any Russian broadcast over the past decade. For example, in 2022, she claimed that the U.S. was funding biolabs in Ukraine. This is a well-known Russian propaganda narrative for which there is no evidence. This drew criticism from both sides of the aisle, with Republicans such as Adam Kinzinger and Mitt Romney accusing her of parroting Russian propaganda. Gabbard has denied these claims consistently and even sent Romney a cease and desist letter as a response.
Gabbard is the former representative for Hawaii who left the Democratic Party in 2022, accusing the party of, quote, cowardly wokeness, anti-white racism, being hostile to people of faith and spirituality, and dragging us closer to nuclear war. Here's her take on how to end the war in Ukraine.
Presidents Putin, Zelensky, and Biden. It's time to put geopolitics aside and embrace the spirit of aloha, respect, and love for the Ukrainian people by coming to an agreement that Ukraine will be a neutral country, no military alliance with NATO or Russia, and therefore alleviate the legitimate security concerns of both US and NATO countries as well as Russia, because there'd be no Russian or NATO troops on each other's non-Baltic borders. This would allow the Ukrainian people to live in peace.
Gabbard was an outspoken critic of Trump's foreign policy decisions during his first term, particularly those hostile to Iran and China. However, she has taken a markedly different approach during this year's election campaign.
And it is because of my love for our country, and specifically because of the leadership that President Trump has brought to transform the Republican Party and bring it back to the party of the people and the party of peace, that I'm proud to stand here with you today, President Trump, and announce that I'm joining the Republican Party.
As Director of National Intelligence, Gabbard would lead America's intelligence community, oversee the National Intelligence Program, and advise the President, the National Security Council, and the Homeland Security Council. Now, Gabbard has never worked in the world of intelligence, and her views appear wildly out of step with the US intelligence community. Not that I think being in step with the intelligence community is in any way a good thing, but it's certainly a striking appointment as far as US interests go. Here's former CIA officer and House Intelligence Committee member, Representative Abigail Spanberger.
Nominating someone who has a clear track record of pushing conspiracy theories and aligning herself and excusing the behavior of authoritarians and dictators like Bashar al-Assad, who she met with shortly after he used chemical weapons on his own citizens, or defending the actions of Vladimir Putin, totally at odds with American interests. Anyone who would do those things is certainly not only an irresponsible choice, but a dangerous choice to fill this role.
After the announcement of the most recent in a swathe really, of contentious Trump nominations, California Representative Ro Khanna said this.
Look, people voted for Donald Trump to have lower prices and a secure border. I don't think they voted for the appointments that they're getting. I've worked as colleagues with both Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gaetz, so I'll let the Senate make their determination. But it's a indication, including of Tom Harmon and also Stephen Miller, of just where this president's going to go. I mean, he is not moving to the center. He's going to his MAGA base. And we'll see if he's overreaching on the mandate that he had from the American people.
Helena, so you've got in charge of justice an alleged sex trafficker, in charge of national intelligence an alleged Russian asset, and certainly a conspiracy nut who has held every possible position on almost every topic since she became a politician. What do you make of this? Is this actually just God-tier trolling, as one of those contributors said?
I think what it really is, it shows what Trump values in terms of his picks, and from what we've seen broadly across a whole slate of appointments that we've heard so far, including these two, of course, is that what he is rewarding is loyalty. That's what he rewards. He rewards people who are loyal to him very specifically. Of course, there was a period in the kind of the pre-2016 era where he had a lot of enemies in the Republican Party. But there have been a lot of people in the background, or people who previously were opposed to him before that time, who since his original first presidential term and through his period in opposition from 2020 to 2024, who've deliberately made a choice to try and court his favorability. Whether they are doing that because they genuinely believe that he has a plan to be able to make the Republican Party the natural party of government there, or whether or not they actually believe in his political ideology that's created the MAGA movement as we've seen it, or whether they are doing it purely for self-interested reasons. There's a whole cadre of people, whether they be from the American First section, like Matt Gaetz, whether they are, quite frankly, what I would term grifters like Tulsi Gabbard, or whether they are kind of establishment neocons who've kind of bit their tongue and decided to latch themselves to Trump's project because they believe it's going to be politically successful, they have done so by deliberately trying to play to what Trump values, which is personal pride, personal loyalty towards him, and the way that he is viewed and what he wants to be liked. And so people who will butter him up, people who will try and cede their own opinions towards his, those are the people that he values, right? Again, the picks themselves, I think, are quite frankly ridiculous. You know, for a party that's been spending the last 4 years accusing everybody who's in any way friendly to the LGBT plus community as being groomers, to then appoint somebody with the allegations that have been levied against Matt Gaetz as they have, shows that maybe that concern isn't quite as sincere as one might think it might be. I wonder. And when it comes to Tulsi Gabbard, she, of course, you said that she's out of step with the US intelligence community. Well, on most things, not in Israel, though. She's very pro-Zionist. She's incredibly pro-Zionist and has been fully backing Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza and increasingly within the West Bank as well. She's clearly been very happy to support pro-Zionist projects, as we've seen for many years now. And while she had some disagreements with the Trump campaign over like the attacks on Soleimani, she has been an anti-Iran hawk in terms of the way broadly which America is going to be dealing with this kind of region in the future, especially given her support of Israel. We've obviously seen her support of Russia and the way that she has links to Putin's regime over there. And on top of that, something wasn't touched on there too, she's very friendly with Narendra Modi as well and the BJP. In fact, The Intercept reported she's had more than 100 donations from people with links to the BJP over in India. And you look at the kind of political projects so she attaches to herself to overseas. You look at the greater Russia chauvinism of Russia. You look at the Hindutva of the BJP and the Zionism of the Israeli government. You see, it's all ethno-nationalism that she supports over there. So whilst she may, in 2016, when she was still a Democratic Party candidate, had been trying to launch her career as being this supporter of left-wing progressive economic policy and trying to run off the coattails of Bernie Sanders, she's realized, well, there's no money in that. There's no support in that. But attaching herself to this America First kind of movement and the ethno-nationalism that a lot of these people will support internally within America, and then kind of slyly trying to slide what was previously an anti-imperialist stance into being an isolationist stance to essentially cede towards the expansionist ambitions of dictators overseas, shows you that she has no guiding moral principles as far as I'm concerned. And all I can see from her broadly is a desire to be able to take whichever position she needs to for her to be politically successful, regardless of how morally consistent they are or not.
Yeah, anyone who thought that the Trump presidency was going to take an isolationist stance really just has to look at the appointments that he's made so far. I mean, it's really more of a kind of unilateralist stance when we're talking about international affairs or geopolitics, where the US wants to be able to operate unilaterally, independently of international organizations or its international obligations in some cases, act unilaterally in America's interests. The point you make about ethno-nationalism is a great one because, what is common to all of the appointments that he's made so far is that they are genuinely Kool-Aid Zionists, really doped up on it. I wanted to ask you just a quick other question, which is just this kind of structural question about what kinds of people might be coming out behind Trump in the Republican Party. I mean, obviously something that's quite interesting is that Trump is necessarily, unless he rips up the Constitution, going to be a one-term president, which means that just 4 years down the road, there is an opportunity for someone to either continue his program, if it's in any way successful, or if he maintains anything like the popularity he had at the beginning of it, or to react against it. So there's two ways in which, you can fight the Republicans from within. I mean, fight as a Republican from within for a nomination if you're close to the Trump presidency. Do you think that's playing any role here in the people who are sort of, who've been practicing that loyalty that you bring up for just a little while now?
I think that one person that I'll be keeping a very large eye on personally is Marco Rubio. very specifically. Because when you look at where people get picked into places, there are certain ones you want to look at as being really important for being future political leaders. Vice president usually actually is not somebody that you'd think of. J.D. Vance, I don't think is going to be the heir apparent to Trumpism as a political project, right? But you look at Marco Rubio specifically, appointing to Secretary of State, that's a really important part of the cabinet. It's a really important cabinet position, and is going to have there's going to be a lot of weight to the decisions that he is going to make during the Trump presidency. That's going to be something that's going to be really impactful. He's going to have a lot of decision making to do. So it's clear that either Trump himself or people close in their campaign have got a lot of trust in Marco Rubio to make decisions that are going to be impactful during the next 4 years. And on top of that, he has clearly decided that he wasn't, after 2016, during that primary campaign, he's decided that he wants to, as I said, soften himself towards the Trump campaign, and has more broadly decided to show loyalty towards the MAGA movement as we've seen it grow over the last 8 years. And on top of that, very crucially, what's the biggest new demographic of Republican Party supporters that we've seen over this last electoral cycle? It is the Hispanic community in America. So having somebody who can speak to that community more broadly, that's going to be really important for the Republican Party to hold their base together. The thing that might undermine a future Republican campaign to win the presidency, to win elections moving forward, is going to be their ability to hold together a very fractured base of new people who are getting in based on Trump's own personal brand, the actual kind of Christian nationalists, the MAGA movement themselves, the kind of the real central part of that, which is Christian nationalism, conspiracy theories, and the Republican base of fiscal conservatives and neocons who don't like Trumpism, but have attached themselves to it for political reasons. And they're going to have to find a candidate who is able to draw this disparate coalition of people together. And I think Marco Rubio is somebody who will really have the strength to be able to do that, and will be able to find some kind of synthesis position that helps the Republican Party to stay together in future.
Yeah, it's not just the Republican Party staying together in future. One of the things we know from the 2016 Trump's 2016 presidency is that actually holding his cabinet together is not that easy, or holding his advisors together is not that easy. There's pretty high turnover. US-China trade relations have been a major story in the recent US elections, and that story is an important one, with the two major superpowers already positioned in powerful economic opposition. Over recent years, relations between the two countries have become increasingly strained, with a newly elected Donald Trump threatening to fan the flames.
Now the Washington Post is saying that you're talking about 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. Is that in the cards?
No, I would say maybe it's going to be more than that.
That was Trump speaking to Fox News back in February. While on the campaign trail, Trump threatened trade tariffs of 60% on some Chinese imports, but as you saw there, he even suggested they could go higher. Now, trade tariffs have long been a Trump obsession. Back in 1988, Trump appeared on Oprah, where the enemy wasn't China, but Japan.
We let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets and everything. It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it, Oprah. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible. They don't have laws against it. They just make it impossible.
By the time Trump ran for president in 2016, he'd changed his target and ramped up the rhetoric.
We got to fix the problem, because we can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
Once in the White House, Trump followed through with that promise. During a steadily escalating trade war with China, Trump's administration imposed and then removed and then reimposed on sanctions on Chinese goods, with China responding in kind. In June 2018, Trump introduced a 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of Chinese exports, declaring it the first of many such actions. The following month, a further $34 billion worth of Chinese goods were tariffed, threatening a further 10% tariff on $200 billion worth of Chinese exports. By September that year, China had also either imposed or promised new tariffs on around $100 billion of US exports, just about all of the goods China imported from the US. But in January 2020, the trade war cooled.
This is a very important and remarkable occasion. Today we take a momentous step, one that has never been taken before with China, toward a future of fair and reciprocal trade as we sign phase one of the historic trade deal between the United States and China.
Now, phase one of that trade deal involved concessions on both sides. China agreed to clamp down on intellectual property rights infringement and to loosen its barriers to food imports from the US. Interestingly, those were largely related to health standards. Anyone remember chlorinated chicken? China also agreed to buy $200 billion worth of US goods over 2 years, but critics of the deal argued it didn't really address US concerns. And in the end, China didn't buy up that extra $200 billion of goods. In fact, by 2020, its purchases of US exports had barely returned to the levels they were before the trade war. During the Biden years, relations with China remained somewhat frosty. Between 2015 and 2024, the number of Chinese entities sanctioned or red flagged by the US has multiplied by 10. But while China may have been surprised by a Trump win in 2016, this time they're much more prepared. In 2021, the country passed sweeping anti-foreign sanction laws, allowing them to counter measures taken by other countries against them. It's also introduced an unreliable entity list for foreign companies that it judges to have undermined its international interests. Stronger export control law also means Beijing can weaponize its dominance of the global supply of dozens of resources such as rare earths and minerals needed, very much needed, crucially needed, by modern technologies. And they have been using those laws. This graph is from the Financial Times. The bars represent the number of US individuals and groups under Chinese foreign sanctions of various kinds, and they've quadrupled since 2021 alone, growing rapidly as the Chinese government appeared to prepare for a Trump presidency. So, what does all of this mean? Earlier today, I was joined by Dr. Elizabeth Ingleson, a specialist in the history of US-China relations at the London School of Economics. I began by asking her whether she thought China or the US came out better in that 2018-2019 trade war.
One of the points about a trade war is that no one wins in the end. So it's really a question of who came out less bad. And in some respects, this was a war that was initially one that Chinese leaders and Xi Jinping in particular were caught off guard with. But one of the consequences of it in terms of what has happened under Xi has been a real effort, an acceleration of an effort towards what we would in the West call de-risking, or towards strengthening China's own industrial capacity so that it isn't caught in such a reliant and off-guard space that it was with the first Trump administration. So in that sense, what the trade war did was it sent a real clear signal to Xi Jinping that he needed to reevaluate China's own position in the global economy. And this is something that had been going on since the global financial crisis of 2008. But this trade war in that sense, while it hurt quite significantly, it also led to sort of long-term structural changes within Xi and China more broadly.
So US-China trade relations in the long arc of history are, as I understand them, fairly recent. Have they always been this sort of fraught and contentious?
So US-China relations, trade relations as they're operating today, are quite distinct in the sense that they are so intertwined and so crucial to the wider global political economy. However, they've got a much longer history, right? The US and China have been trading since the United States was founded. China was an important part of the early American Republic. And there have been periods throughout the history of US-China relations when the trade relationship has been very fraught indeed. It's been connected in many ways to the status of the political relationship. So when the political relationship has been under fire or has been fraught, so to have trade relations become a casualty of that larger political division. One of the most obvious and important examples is in the sort of early Cold War era, when the United States and China had no trade relations for over 20 years. It was a consequence of the Korean War and the fighting in which US and Chinese combatants were the major sort of groups fighting one another in Korea. And as a consequence of this real Cold War hostility, the United States imposed a complete embargo on trade and other kinds of relations with China. And it was really only in the 1970s that trade embargo began to be lessened, and the two countries did begin to rebuild a relationship in that period. So trade has mirrored in some ways the political dynamics of the two countries. Where things are much more complicated today is that US-Chinese trade relationship is so intertwined, not just with one another, but with the wider international political economy. So it's not simply or is easily a bilateral relationship as much as someone like Trump would like it to be treated that way. And certainly tariffs are an indication of a thinking of trade in terms of two countries. But we're familiar in 2024 with all of the other ways in which countries are affected by and intertwined with the bilateral relationship through supply chains and other dynamics. So we're dealing with a trade relationship where the capacity for the politics to influence the trade has a much larger sort of set of repercussions than it once did when trade and the political economy looked quite different.
I'm really glad you brought up supply chains because I wanted to ask you about this. So Trump often kind of pitches the problem with China in two ways. One is the trade deficit between the US and China, where Chinese imports into the US far exceed US exports into China. But the other is he often talks about it in terms of reindustrialization of the US, so bringing back jobs to the US. Now, these both sound sort of like rather old-fashioned concerns in the way that the kind of bilateralism that you talked about is also kind of fictional. Is this really anything to do with what lies behind these trade wars or these trade disputes? Is it really about reindustrialization of the US, or is it more about things like, components required for technology, minerals, and so forth?
Well, I think these two things are happening at the same time. Is that there is an issue with components and minerals and chips that, particularly under the Biden administration, American policymakers have targeted China in certain ways. But the bigger story that you're getting at in terms of sort of this vision or ideal of the American economy as being based upon white men working in factories in hard hats is something that has been incredibly difficult to dislodge in American political culture. And so this notion that manufacturing is at the heart of the American economy and heart of what it means to be a worker in the United States taps into a much longer and deeper connection to work and labor in the US that stems from the post-World War II era, in which manufacturing employment was a crucial component of the American economy. But what's really happened since the 1970s, and in fact, since the United States and China did begin to trade again in the 1970s, is that the way in which the American economy began to operate moved further and further away from manufacturing employment. What happened, though, was that manufacturing itself remained relatively stable in the United States. So the process that we call, in retrospect, deindustrialization isn't the end or the sort of decline of manufacturing as a whole. In fact, as a sector of American GDP, manufacturing has remained relatively stable. What's gone into decline is manufacturing employment. So in today's economy, it's only about 8% of American workers, or 8% of the US employment figures that comprise manufacturing. The vast, vast majority of American workers work in the service sector. It's about 80%, depending on your figures. Some of the figures are even higher. And so we have a real disjunction between the political rhetoric that Trump has been able to capitalize upon, this rhetoric that remains really seeped in this sort of mid-20th century notion of the ideal American white male worker, with the reality of what the American workforce and working people really look like. And I think that disjunction is not coincidental to the fact that we currently have the liberal media questioning how it is that when you have a US economic figures, GDP, unemployment numbers, etc., that are on the one hand suggesting the American economy is doing very well, and on the other hand you have the lived reality of the American economy that working people are so familiar with, which is that it's extraordinarily difficult to make a living through. And part of the explanation for that is that precisely because of this transition in how the American economy has operated since the mid-1970s in particular, where one of the key things that happened was the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system and the turn towards dollar gold, or the end of dollar gold convertibility and the turn towards floating exchange rates, is that allowed for capital and finance to underpin so much of how the American economy operated. It encouraged the creation of supply chain dynamics of offshore manufacturing. It was a facilitating factor in what we call sweatshops and overseas manufacturing. This sort of financialization of the American economy was crucial to these dynamics. And yet, that prioritization of capital at the expense of labor is precisely why we have such a bifurcated and divided sort of set of experiences within the American economy today.
What do you think the next few years are going to bring in terms of US-China trade relations, given that perhaps domestically in the US political pressure will build as the electorate don't see the kinds of results that they've been promised?
If these tariffs are imposed, if Trump does impose the 60% tariffs on China, and it's important to keep in mind that there is a degree to which they are being threatened as a negotiating factor in sort of a larger set of trade negotiations with China. But if even part of these tariff threats are imposed, it will have a really significant impact on American working people and American society. I think more broadly, there are two key things to keep an eye on. And the first has to do with what China will do in terms of its own green energy production and in terms of its own positionality within the global political economy as a leader in green energy production and in green energy creation. One of the key statistics coming out from last year was that 40% of China's GDP growth came from the production of renewable energy. 40% of its GDP growth. That's a really significant number, and it points to a potentially very significant structural change happening within the Chinese economy. Now, there are real question marks over the extent to which China's capacity to maintain that green energy production will happen. But when you have, as we will have in the White House, a climate denier, there's a real scope for China to position itself within the world economy and more broadly politically as a leader on the environment and on green energy. The second thing that I would say to keep an eye on is the extent to which the American dollar is able to sustain its own dominance, given this movement, if the movement does take place, towards protectionism and towards a much more sort of insular American economy. It would really throw into question the extent to which emerging markets throughout the global south will be able to sustain their own relationships and their own pegging of their economies to the US. And so there's a real question mark then, as a consequence of Trump, of the extent to which the US will be able to maintain the financial dominance that it currently has in the world financially, and underpinning that is the trade relationships too. And so these two things will work potentially together to create an opening for China, both in terms of green energy production, but also in terms of the renminbi, China's currency, which it's been long trying to position as an alternative to the dollar.
We've been watching the unfolding of Trump's new cabinet over the last few days, and peppered within it, or even more than peppered within it, are quite a lot of China hawks. So the most striking being Marco Rubio as Secretary of State pick. There comes a moment, I guess, where what you might think of as just economic opposition, trade opposition, becomes strategic opposition or political opposition, geopolitical opposition. Do you think that this next presidency could be that moment for the US and China?
There are two key strands of thought that may come into debate and clash, but all may seek to complement one another. And one strand, as you suggest, is this very sort of hawkish regime change aspect of how to approach China, which has very long history in American foreign policy more broadly. In many ways, it's sort of a back to the future kind of vision. Matt Pottinger and others within the US within the sort of US DC circles and around Trump have made these arguments for a number of years now that what's crucial to sort of US relations with China is to push for this regime change and to push on the human rights angle. Where I think we're going to see even more of a change, I suppose, is the second thread, which, as I say, could work complementary to that hawkish thing, or could be seen as a sort of tension with that. There's certainly distinctions in the position. And the second one is one that says the United States needs to focus all of its foreign policy efforts on Asia, that thwarting Chinese primacy is the key goal, and that this is part of the larger movement away from Europe, that the United States needs to focus its attention on Asia. And one part of that sort of very hard realpolitik perspective is to say the United States needs to build alliances in Asia, to do so very transactionally. We've already seen hints of that through Trump's claims that Taiwan needs to pay a protection fee if it wants to have or maintain relations or military protection from the United States. And so that other aspect of thinking in the sort of Trump circles is one that's extremely transactional, very sort of zero-sum in both how it understands foreign policy and how it understands alliances within Asia, and would be very much based upon an overt attempt to stop Chinese primacy in Asia and to halt China's position. One thing I'll say is that if there had been a Harris administration, there were voices within DC that were pushing back against what is considered a bipartisan consensus on China, that bipartisan consensus was more wobbly than many within the media presented. And there was potential that some of those voices within DC may have had an influence, however minor or not, within a Harris administration. And so what we're seeing with Trump's victory is a real shift away from those possibilities and towards a cementing of the larger zero-sum Cold War mentality when it comes to China.
That was Elizabeth Ingleson speaking with me earlier today. The bougie ice cream company Ben & Jerry's is suing its parent company, the British multinational consumer goods giant Unilever. Why? Well, Ben & Jerry's claims that Unilever silenced it from speaking out in support of Palestine. It also claims that Unilever threatened to dismantle its board and sue board members over the issue. Unilever rejects these claims, but in the lawsuit, Ben & Jerry's says it has tried to call for a ceasefire, it has tried to support safe passage for Palestinian refugees to the UK, it's tried to back US student protests on Gaza, and it tried to advocate for the Biden administration to stop sending military aid to Israel. But in each area, it claims to have been effectively muzzled by Unilever. Tensions have been simmering between the ice cream manufacturer and its parent company for years. In 2021, Ben & Jerry's tried to take a stand on illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. Ben & Jerry's said it would stop selling its products there, as doing so was inconsistent with its brand values. So Unilever decided to sell its Ben & Jerry's business in Israel and the West Bank to Israeli licensee Avi Zinger, allowing marketing in the West Bank and Israel to continue. Ben & Jerry's responded by suing Unilever in 2022 to try to block the sale. That 2022 lawsuit was settled in the same year, and the terms of the settlement were not made public. But in their new lawsuit, Ben & Jerry's is now accusing Unilever of breaching the terms of the 2022 settlement. The brand says Peter Culver, Unilever's head of ice cream, that is a job, voiced concerns about, quote, the continued perception of anti-Semitism regarding Ben & Jerry's speaking up for Gazan refugees. The 2022 settlement also required Unilever to make a $5 million payment that Ben & Jerry's could donate to human rights groups of its choice. Ben & Jerry's picked Jewish Voice for Peace and the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, amongst others. According to the lawsuit, Unilever wasn't happy with Ben & Jerry's choosing a Jewish Voice for Peace, saying it was, quote, too critical of the Israeli government. Now, Unilever owns plenty of popular household brand names, including Pot Noodle, Marmite, Dove, Vaseline, Persil, and Hellmann's mayonnaise. And it will be divesting of its ice cream holdings, which include Magnum, Cornetto, and Ben & Jerry's by the end of 2025. Good. If it divests of them, maybe we can buy them again. Helena, what do you make of this story? What does this tell us about corporate culture and the power that corporations have to influence policy when it comes to Israel?
I mean, broadly across our entire kind of ecosystem, they influence everything. Not just how we talk about Israel and Palestine, for example, which of course is something that intimately tied to the fact that the vast majority of these companies and this corporate governance that we've seen, the corporate capture of like huge swathes of the entirety of economies in the global north and to a lesser extent in the global south, is of course part of the imperial interests and the broader capitalist interests that we see internationally, right? So what do we always say about Israel? It's not just the fact that there is the internal issues with regards to what we criticize them for, but the imperial interests of countries in the global north and their support for an outpost in the region. And the capital interests of the outpost in the region is broadly supported across all of the different corporations across the global north, right? And so what we need to understand as well is that this doesn't just happen with regards to Israel, as I said. So, for example, when you look at the big share portfolios across all of these kind of private investment firms, you've seen places like BlackRock, for example. One thing we've seen BlackRock try and do, and Larry Fink has been very clear on this, is using their position as kind of very large shareholders in these companies is to try and influence the way in which that they do their own business towards what they perceive to be the corporate goals, right, of people like Larry Fink. This ties into this idea of the change towards stakeholder capitalism. Now, I don't agree with a lot of the kind of right-wing weirdo conspiracy theory stuffs about Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and the influence of stakeholder capitalism as being this kind of way of maintaining huge amounts of control, right? But what you do see is how this is supposed to be this safety valve with regards to how the huge amount of capture that we've seen of our economies by corporations to try and get plausible deniability that they're doing things in everybody's interest, right? That's what stakeholder capitalism as a concept is supposed to be there to do, and say, no, there's no problem with the infiltration of huge amounts of our economy by a very small number of people and a very small number of powerful entities, right? There's no problem because we have the interests of the stakeholders, everybody at large, right? Well, hang on a minute. Well, what if do your stakeholders include the people of Palestine? No, or except there's not interest. That does not share the interest of the primacy of the shareholder, right? The idea of stakeholder capitalism as a kind of governing principle that we've seen from a lot of these kind of new corporate types. And this doesn't actually in any way end shareholder primacy in terms of where the actual loyalty lies for lots of these companies, which is the power of the shareholders, which again has a material interest in the global north's imperial interest in the Middle East and elsewhere. So that's not going to change. No matter how many times you see, well, one of the parts of corporate culture we want to change, for example, you've seen Larry Fink say this, is in terms of inclusion, right? This is where a lot of right-wingers get mad about it and say, well, we're seeing diversity, equity, and inclusion being pushed by corporate governance. I'm like, no, they just understand that that's a way that they can use to be able to pander to certain new markets, right? It's nothing to do with the fact that there's this kind of central kind of plan to be able to get people's behavior to change. This is a way of being able to maximize shareholder returns in the same way that support for Israel is there to maximize shareholder returns for people who have Western interests, who support Western interests in the region. And that's a problem. And of course, what is the solution? Of course, the solution, of course, is worker ownership. It's always been it's always the worker ownership, of course, because then it is within the interests of the companies themselves to decide what they want to do, rather having to rely on whoever is the parent company to decide for them what opinions they should hold and whether or not they should be allowed to hold them, or indeed individual owners themselves. They can be a collective decision of those who work there. I don't have any problem of people deciding where they spend their money or deciding on the ownership opinions of certain companies as to where they want to spend their money in a market economy. I have no issues with that. If Unilever don't want to be associated with people who are pro-Palestine, they're well within their rights to do that. But what they shouldn't be doing is gagging people below them to stop them doing that, because we've got this gigantic amount of conglomerate ownership of loads of these companies. We should be able to make our own decisions on our own, the way in which we interact with other people within a market economy based upon our own values, rather than being set down from the top, which can only happen in the way that it has done with this broader corporate capture of our entire economy that's been happening over the last 20 to 30 years since the dawn of neoliberalism.
Many of you will have seen our coverage earlier this week of the media's masterclass in manipulation over football hooliganism in Amsterdam. Our report laid bare how outlet after outlet twisted the truth to fit a narrative that served Israel. Did we get reports on Israeli football fans chanting genocidal and racist slogans, burning Palestinian flags, and generally causing chaos in Amsterdam before the city clapped back? No. We got news that conformed to the hasty conclusions of Western leaders, pogroms, and purely anti-Semitic attacks. Now, this is hardly the first time the media have turned themselves into a weapon in Israel's war on Gaza. In fact, right from the beginning, Western outlets from the BBC to CNN and from The Guardian to the New York Times have made themselves complicit in the murder of tens of thousands of Palestinians. And they've done this in three important ways, starting as soon as Israel's assault began. First, they've concealed important context from their audiences. After October the 7th, the media repeatedly asked this question.
Do you condemn what Hamas did?
Do you support what Hamas launched?
Will you now take the opportunity to condemn what Hamas did on October the 7th?
Though you cannot condone the killing of civilians in Israel, can you?
Now, that question served to frame anyone who was trying to contextualize the day or raise concerns about Israel's response as illegitimate. This was an attempt to silence any speaker sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, including almost every Palestinian invited on air, by casting them as suspicious. And the question effectively erased discussion of Israel's oppression and occupation of the Palestinians from public view right from the start. And when Palestinians did try to talk about history, they were misrepresented. Here's one striking example. On the 10th of October last year, Sky's Kay Burley more than once accused Hussam Zomlot, Palestinian ambassador to the UK, of saying of October 7th that Israel had it coming.
The Palestinian ambassador basically said the last couple of days that Israel had it coming. This is an atrocious comment by the Palestinian ambassador to the UK.
What Zomlot actually said was, Israel knew this was coming their way. Sky later apologized.
Now, on Sky News Breakfast early this month, we reported that the Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Dr. Hussam Zomlot, said in reference to the Hamas attacks on Israel on the 7th of October that Israel had it coming. We recognise that this was not what Dr. Zomlot had said in an earlier interview.
So they apologized, but do you see the trick? Second, instead of providing context to Israel's war, the media has preferred fiction.
Babies, their heads cut off. That's what they said.
The Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman just confirmed babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated.
I really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children.
Time and time again, journalists failed to challenge Israel's assertions. Another example, they repeatedly allowed Israeli officials to broadcast the myth of the country's precise military operations in Gaza without scrutiny. Meanwhile, claims of widespread systematic sexual assault on 7th of October continue to be stated as fact, and that's despite many of the sources of those claims proving to be unreliable. Third, Palestinians have been constantly dehumanized and their political aims and aspirations erased. Instead, Palestinians have been cast as either terrorists or victims of a humanitarian disaster. That's a binary that erases the notion of Palestinian resistance from the public conversation. And that binary also benefits Israel. If Palestinians are all terrorists, then they can be killed without accountability. And if they're just the victims of a humanitarian disaster, no one needs to worry about the causes of this blameless natural crisis. Either way, media outlets can avoid speaking about who killed Palestinians when they simply die in their thousands.
In Gaza, Hamas officials say at least 700 people have been killed.
More than 1,400 people have been killed.
50 children have been killed in 48 hours in Jabalia in northern Gaza.
The war in Gaza continues with significant civilian casualties.
Instead of calling for the bombs to stop, the media can focus on calling for aid to get in. And instead of exposing the causes of this genocide, the media can adopt the much more comfortable frame of an inexplicable disaster. So why have Western audiences lapped up this false framing? That's easy. They've long been conditioned to view events involving the Middle East through racist, Islamophobic narratives. For at least the last 23 years, the war on terror has been the lazy and simplifying lens through which countries like the US and its allies have justified all manner of violence.
And rid the world of thousands of terrorists and freed a country from brutal oppression. We are winning the war on terror.
This fake war on terror stamp on the Arab world has created false contrasts between terrorists and victims, between barbaric chaos and liberal order. It's erased all distinctions between different groups of rebellious Muslims. It's merged resistance with insurgents, conflated independence movements with Islamist imperialist projects, positioning all as a threat to Western democracy. Here's a fact. On October 7th last year, every journalist in every newsroom in the West knew exactly what Israel would do to Gaza. What's been lacking isn't knowledge, they all had it, but the moral courage to report the truth. Because it takes courage to report honestly on a genocide and courage to reveal the Western complicity required to make it possible. And it takes even more courage to cut a clear path through a colonial history of abuse and occupation that Western audiences have long been trained to ignore and reject. Helena, it's been over 400 days since the war on Gaza began, since the genocide began. Have you seen any improvement in the media coverage of the genocide since then?
There have been certain improvements that I've seen from some places. Now, it's been patchy in where you get the good coverage from. I think obviously some outlets are better than others. For example, I've been far more impressed with, I've seen reporting from places like Channel 4 than I have from places like the BBC, for example. It's definitely patchy in terms of where you get the coverage from. What's interesting, I find that the nature at which, even if the underlying assumptions haven't gone away, that the level of bias hasn't changed, or indeed that the framing, in that the lopsided framing hasn't really changed over the last 400 days. What has changed is the level to which plausible deniability is even possible at any point, right? We've mentioned a lot on our show about how no matter what the mainstream media report, we can all go on our phones. We can all see on our social media feeds what's happening to Gazans, the testimonies of people who are not necessarily covered by the mainstream media, discussing what has been going on in Gaza, whether or not they are Gazans themselves, or whether or not they are aid workers giving their own testimony on what's been happening within the occupied territories, right? There has been plenty of coverage outside of mainstream media. So for the entirety of the period where they've tried to have this lens of plausible deniability, that doesn't exist anymore. That's stopped now. What they have now got is they have this level to which that they try and present things without making any distinction, and then allowing people who've already been primed through the previous framing to continue viewing it through that, even though most of us have already seen the reality, again, with what we've seen on our social media feeds. So it's difficult. It's difficult for them to be able to play that game any longer. I think it's very interesting that the narrative of East versus West has been what you say in your piece there, Stephen. That's been very pervasive, not just in terms of with the media reporting it, but the ways in which in interviews with Western media, Israeli politicians have explicitly done that as well. You remember the Hasbara narrative that we saw right at the start of this conflict, where they said, well, Hamas is ISIS, when they're completely different in terms of their overall outlook. Again, trying to talk about Hamas as if they aren't a Palestinian nationalist movement, right? You can critique, you can criticize, and you can oppose their methods, you can oppose their beliefs, you can oppose their ideology all that you want. But to mischaracterize them as being Islamist first and foremost, and then Palestinian nationalists second, that is a big misstep in terms of an accurate reporting of the reasons for why we have this conflict in the first place. The reason why Hamas exists as an entity is because of the material conditions of the Palestinian people, right? They are part of the synthesis between we've seen the conflict since 1967. They would not exist were it not for the occupation. That is something that is based in the conditions that that is based on the conditions that the Palestinian people have been subjected to for the last for over half a century. So that framing of trying to get people in the West to see them as people who are just there as part of a broader movement to establish a caliphate rather than to reclaim their own territory that they had been ethnically cleansed from during the Nakba is it underlies the lack of reporting that we've seen broadly since 1948 to educate Western audiences on the realities of the Israel-Palestine conflict ever since 1948. Because you can remember as well, that it would be very tempting. It's very tempting for a lot of people to look at this very biased coverage, to look at what we've seen as being a narrative that is very pervasive throughout a lot of our mainstream media in the West, and to try and imply that there's somebody in the halls of power of our media who's getting people to report things in a biased manner. And we have seen things like documents about acceptable language, for example. I can't forget which American news media organization it was. Well, you can't say genocide, you can't say occupation, you can't say any of these words that might lend people to understand the reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict. You can't say those things because then people would have their assumptions challenged. But what this is more of is an example of manufactured consent. It's nothing to do with people saying things that they know are untrue. It's not people manipulating bad data deliberately. This is a case of ideological groupthink. This is people who are already part of these assumptions before they come into the newsrooms themselves. In the wise words of Noam Chomsky, I fully believe that you are sincere in everything that you personally believe. But if you believed anything different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting right now in terms of the mainstream media.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was the New York Times that you were referring to when you were talking about the editorial guidelines, not using the term genocide. And I was thinking of the term Holocaust because, of course, we recently published a piece by a Palestinian writer who wanted to use the word Holocaust to describe the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And The Guardian said no. And so she came to us and we did publish it and we did use that word. And I think that was something that we should be very proud of as an organization. One of the things that strikes me so much about the coverage is that, it's sometimes, mainstream media does things that are good. You can't deny it. So, for example, Sky last night did a very compelling report, very disturbing report, in fact, on the killing in an Israeli jail of one of Gaza's most esteemed surgeons. And it focused in on the individual case, the brutality that this man suffered at the hands of Israeli soldiers and then Israeli jailers. And then, of course, you get a zooming out that it does where it talks about, quite vague terms, what is happening in Gaza. So you get these sort of individual stories being told, which are very important stories to tell. And you get, sometimes interviews with people talking about how many times they've had to move, which is a very, very important story to tell. But you never get the joining of the dots that says, okay, well, there is a phenomenon that's happening here. And it has a word, genocide. So few mainstream outlets are prepared to even entertain that word. And I think the UN today has just come out and they've said something about meeting the conditions for genocide, potentially meeting the conditions for genocide. And I wonder if I don't think it will because, the ICJ has already, used the word genocide. It hasn't said that Israel is committing a genocide, but it's nonetheless associated that word with Israel in laying in making an order about what Israel was supposed to do, which has been widely ignored. I wonder if maybe it's not going to make a difference, but do you think these international bodies increasingly being comfortable with the use of that word is at some point going to tip the media in that direction, or will they just resist it completely?
I think they will probably resist it until they have the time to do so. I mean, I wish I could go back in time to the 90s and see how people reported on the Yugoslav wars and what happened in Bosnia. What we know now, obviously, it took decades of litigation to be able to determine at least partly of which of that was a genocide in legal terms. I don't know how it was referred to before those conditions were met, and whether or not that changed people's viewpoints in terms of international organizations commenting on it beforehand. I don't know, but I'd be interested to see. I think that just like most organizations that don't have there's no interest in them in taking a very forceful line on this. They'll probably still want to make things at least as neutral as possible in their regard. What I find interesting, obviously you said you had the word Holocaust in your mind, right? This is a word that Ronald Reagan used to describe the intervention or the invasion of Lebanon by Israel in the 1980s, right? So to say that it's beyond the pale to be thinking of these words in terms only when the American president used that, like it's not beyond the realms of possibility. And there was one thing I was going to say, and it's completely slipped my mind. I really apologize for this. But yes, I certainly agree with you that there is a potential that they might do, but whether or not that happens anytime soon remains to be seen.
Helena, I'm very glad to discover that I'm not the only one who has the occasional senior moment. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Helena.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I look forward to next time. You take care.
I look forward to that too. And thank you everyone for watching. Come back tomorrow for another stream at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.